And the current idea that has captured our state is one that seems to be demonstrating cognitive dissonance. And this is summed up by Elon Musk's meme. So Elon Musk, obviously, notorious S poster, and also the world's richest man, and the world's second most famous man, only to Donald Trump, has posted the following. It's the old Tobey Maguire Spider-Man meme. Threat to democracy, you put your glasses on. Threat to bureaucracy. Of course, Oren McIntyre has been saying this for a while, with the total state, that the entire purpose of the managerial state is to manufacture consent for the expansion of the managerial state, to measure more things, to control more things, to manufacture and prolong crises as a reason why the state must intervene into your life more and more, to diminish the concentric circles of family, congregation, faith, nation, and have the liberal individual stand naked and afraid in the face of raw state power. And so they submit to it because they think there's no other civic institution which will insulate them from arbitrary tyranny. Or, a great example of this as well, has been Tim Pool saying our democracy is synonymous with our, as in the people that are saying it's oligarchy. It's an exclusive club and we aren't in it. And whenever they say they're a threat to our democracy, they mean that those who vote differently to them are a threat to their personal political order. That's all very true. But I would contest that this logic would not have taken hold in any other nation than the liberal European and Anglosphere nations, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War, where sort of blank slate liberalism has been put on steroids, the insistence we need to be an open society to ensure that even in the nations that didn't perpetrate the Holocaust, the guard towers of Auschwitz shall never be resurrected. Of course, nobody wants that. Mercifully, we don't need that. But it seems that an in-group preference for one's own culture, history, heritage, ethnicity, identity has been conflated with the National Socialists of 1930s Germany. And that has led to a worship of blank slate liberal ideals. And that's where I think a lot of this is founded. Our democracy is not just a pure cynical play to say we want to reinforce our own power. It actually connects to a broader utopian goal that comes out of, yes, Marxism, but also classical liberalism, because of the anthropology of the Enlightenment. I'm sure there'll be some disagreement in the comments over whether or not certain politicians themselves are liberal or Marxist, whether they're honest or stupid or a mixture of dishonest and thick. But I hope I can draw out the connective tissue between not just what the politicians say and what they might believe, but the reason why the things they say have taken hold in this specific place and time, and why they seem intuitive as a kind of NPC programming for default liberals, not just dyed-in-the-wool Marxists, intersectionals, or anti-white racists who are prejudiced against people from a different ethnicity. For example, Humza Yousaf isn't making a nuanced point about liberal egalitarianism when he's decrying every institution of Scotland as white, but the sorts of woke white people that will allow Humza Yousaf to get away from that rhetoric may not necessarily be conscious race Marxists. They might just think of themselves as soft social liberals who want to be against discrimination. This is the kind of thing Eric Kaufman was writing about in both White Shift, but more broadly in Taboo, or the Third Great Awakening, depending on which country you're in. But in this podcast, I want to talk about specifically how the ideology of our institutions have layered that default liberalism atop the population, and why it seems to make sense that they can act with complete authoritarianism to quash, quote-unquote, threats to democracy. But first, I want to unpack how these liberals are going about evangelizing the message that they can take anti-democratic measures to defend democracy. I mean, we've seen it with Joe Biden's infamous MAGA speech in, I think it's Pennsylvania Hall, with the blood-red background of Marines behind him that he didn't salute because no one was in his ear telling him to. But we've seen it throughout their various propaganda outlets. Great example of this is the New York Times. So here's this recent article that you might have seen. The Constitution is sacred. Is it also dangerous? Yes. And as Aaron McIntyre has pointed out, that's the point. But this is a very honest piece. It's getting an underlying truth. So this was written on August 31st, 2024 by Jennifer Slazai, and her chief complaint here is with the indirect democratic, Republican mechanism, not party, mechanisms detailed in the Constitution. So the idea of the Electoral College, for example, or the Supreme Court, all these sorts of institutions that prevent it from being a direct democracy, which they believe, if they achieve, will enable uniform universal, reliable, progressive outcomes from here into the end of time without them necessarily needing to fortify it. So she writes, the United States Constitution is in trouble after Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. He called for, quote, the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution. Outraged critics denounced him for threatening a document that's supposed to be sacrosanct by announcing his desire to throw off constitutional constraints. In order to satisfy his personal ambitions, Trump was making his authoritarian inclinations abundantly clear, playing to the New York Times peanut gallery, of course. But it's no surprise then that liberals charged Trump with being a menace to the Constitution, but his presidency and the prospect of his re-election have also generated another very different argument, that Trump owes his political assent to the Constitution, making him a beneficiary of a document that is essentially anti-democratic and, in this day and age, increasingly dysfunctional. The anguish is, in some sense, a flip side of veneration. Americans have long assumed the Constitution could save us. A growing chorus now wonders whether or not we need to be saved from it. Now, look, there's a reason why the likes of the New York Times columnists believe there are more direct democracy or throwing out certain provisions and protections of the Constitution may be advantageous to the Democrat Party and their progressive allies. Because any time it looks like they're going to lose an election, of course they're going to cry foul and try and change the rules. The more honest part about this is that the idea that checks and balances are in place goes against the liberal anthropology that says people are fundamentally good, and actually it's just institutions, inequalities, racism, and noticing differences that makes man fallen, corrupted, violent. And so all you need to do is remove the guardrails, actually, allow man to be totally free, totally unencumbered by outside influences, by cultural pressures, by a recognition of biological and geographical limits, and then man will recognize that he is free and equal with his brethren, and we will have peace and prosperity. Everyone is just as American or British as you or I, no matter where they were born and what they believe. And so the Constitution is actually in the way of having unmitigated freedom, which will result in unmitigated equality, which will result in everyone choosing what is in their rational self-interest, which are, of course, Democrat policies. This is the ideology of the blank slate enacted through political means. She then makes this case, essentially, for the blank slate by focusing on what Eric Kaufman on my show called the Big Bang of Woke, and that is, in the American context, slavery, Jim Crow, and the civil rights movement. So she writes, Frederick Douglass maintained the opposite. Slavery in the United States could only be upheld by claiming that the Constitution does not mean what it says. As the historian James Oakes puts it, Douglass shared Abraham Lincoln's view, recognizing in the Constitution the promise of universal freedom. The legacy of this history is a stubborn ambivalence. Is the Constitution supposed to be a guarantor of human equality? Or, for a society with a profoundly inegalitarian origin story, is the lofty principle just hypocritical cover? You might think such disputes would have been laid to rest by a bloody civil war and the Reconstruction Amendments, which outlawed slavery and granted all men the right to vote regardless of race. Not to mention that the Constitution continued to change in the century after senators were to be directly elected, women were granted the right to vote, but the last 50 years, the Constitution has appeared frozen in amber. The last major amendment, in 1971, lowered the voting age to 18. In reaction to landmark decisions prohibiting segregation and bans on interracial marriage, conservative legal scholars began to champion judicial interpretations that rested on the framers' intentions 200 years before. Originalists, as these scholars call themselves, say they are simply reacting to decades of overreach by activist judges. Liberal critics counter that interpreting the law according to what the founders supposedly wanted amounts to an end run around protecting and promoting a multiracial democracy. So the purpose, according to the likes of Slazai and the New York Times and the Democrats, is of statecraft not to craft the right checks and balances on human fallibility, to keep power in check, to deliberate and produce a compromise that best services the material and cultural limits of a people in a given place and time. It is instead to give rise to man's egalitarian nature, which we have been tragically rendered away from by the mistakes of our forefathers in creating a civilization in the first place, to strip us of the kind of Marxist false consciousness that we have had instilled in us by the recognition of material inequality, and to have us realize we are all free and equal, and so anyone can come and go from any given country and any set of traditions as they please. That actually all differences are superficial, and the state exists to ensure that everyone plays nice from here till the end of time. And so checks and balances on the state are actually an inhibition of them doing this on our behalf. And so these originalist judges, these Republican activists, the people trying to uphold and go by the letter of the Constitution to expand the franchise and end slavery, are actually playing containment for what we could do right now, which is ensure everyone is free and equal as of tomorrow. So these people are preventing utopia from being put in place. This is the mentality here. Another New York Times essay with an equally provocative title that makes a similar case was this. Now, I got the archive version up here because the title was changed. The original title is Elections Are Bad to Democracy. The title was changed, The Worse People Run for Office Is Better That Way, obviously after substantial backlash on X. This is a pretty honest piece about how the system may be set up to self-perpetuate the administrators of that multicultural utopia, to extol the kinds of values and policies that flat-pack construct the state of nature, the ultimate democratic utopia, often through non-democratic means. So, throughout this piece, ask yourself, what does democracy mean in this context? Because we're going to formulate a definition of democracy because we have to work on a new one because we don't have a shared understanding of these people, right? Whenever they say threat to democracy, we always go, how can they be a threat to democracy if they were elected democratically, if they were popular? Populism is the ultimate expression of democracy, right? It's just telling the people what they want, sometimes what they want to hear, rather than actually delivering on what they want to hear, but then promising to deliver on it, winning the most number of votes, and getting elected. So how can you frustrate a democratically elected regime with non-democratic bodies like the intelligence services or the civil service or the military lying to Trump about pulling troops out of Syria? How could you possibly do this and still be champions of democracy? Well, democracy doesn't mean what you or I think it means to people who believe in the blank slate. Thank you for watching that clip from Tomlinson Talks. If you liked that and you would like to see more, you can get the full 90-minute show every week on a Wednesday afternoon, live from 3 p.m, only on lotuseaters.com, and all of the other content that my colleagues produce behind the paywall for as little as £5 a month. Thank you very much for supporting us, and I hope to see you there. Until next time, goodbye.